Welcome to this interview with Joan Kwon Glass, author of the new book Daughter of Three Gone Kingdoms and winner of the 2024 Perugia Press Prize. I'm Evelyn Chi, an intern at Perugia Press and rising senior at Amherst College, who will be interviewing Joan today. To give a short introduction to the book, Daughter of Three Gone Kingdoms is part lamentation and part hymn, an illumination of diasporic hungers, hauntings, absence, and resilience. Cast across continents and centuries, matrilineage and inherited silences. Daughter of Three Gone Kingdoms explores colonialism and post-colonialism through disordered eating, suicide loss, religious damage, familial estrangement, addiction, motherhood, and recovery. Thank you, Joan. Could you briefly introduce yourself? You can give your pronouns, your occupation, any previous publications, and anything else you'd like to add.
Sure. Thank you, Evelyn. It's really nice to meet you. I'm looking forward to answering your very thoughtful questions. And my name is Joan Kwon Glass, and this is my second full-length collection. My first full-length collection is called Night Swim and was published by Diode Editions in 2022. I have two chapbooks as well. The first one was also published in 2022 and is called How to Make Pancakes for a Dead Boy. And it was published through Harbor Editions, Small Harbor Publishing. My other chapbook is called If Rust Can Grow on the Moon and was published by Milk and Cake Press, also in 2022. 2022 was a big year in my life. I live in coastal Connecticut in a town called Milford, which is near New Haven. And I'm a middle school social studies teacher on the Gold Coast, which is down in southern Fairfield County, kind of close to New York. And yeah, I'm just thrilled to have this new book coming out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
awesome.
I love reading it. So that first actual question of the interview is about your first poem, Bloodline. It's the opening poem, and in it you describe the creation myth of Korea, in which an ex-god and a bear-turned woman give birth to the first ruler of Korea. You write, the first Koreans were part god, part beast. Every morning I look in the mirror and ask, which will I be today? Um, why did you choose Bloodline to be your opening poem, and how does the poem's discussion of themes like mythology, lineage, and identity set the tone for the rest of the book?
So the poem Bloodline I wrote after doing some research into Korean mythology, and it stood out to me very significantly and spoke to me because I feel like it's a struggle that I've experienced throughout my life in various ways. In one way, asking myself what kind of a person do I want to be in the world does have to do with identity and diaspora. Um, because I am half white and half Korean, and I've often been white passing, not by any desire of my own, but that has given me a lot of strange experiences in my life because when people can't figure out what you are or where you come from, you sometimes get to hear things and be privy to things that you might not. So that's one aspect of it. Another is the fact that I'm in recovery from substances and making the decision on a daily basis not to use drugs, not to drink alcohol, when it's such a big part of society, especially drinking, and really waking up every day and making that choice. And in other areas of my life, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. Sometimes I wake up and I don't know. I don't know if I can be the person that I want to be on that particular day when it comes to being the best version of myself that I can present to the world. So I think in some ways, to answer that question, I chose this poem because it speaks directly to mythology and Korean history, but it also spoke directly to me personally in terms of my own individual and personal struggles with other aspects of my identity.
Yeah, amazing. I love that poem, by the way. Um,
Thank you.
I love that line that I like read recently.
That
Um,
poem, an earlier version of that poem was first published by Chen Chen in Lickety Split a couple of 2, 3 years ago.
mhm.
So I was really excited to, include it in the book. I thought it made sense to include it. The entire book focuses on struggle and conflict and binaries, uh, and the divisiveness that we can experience externally, but also the divisiveness that we can experience internally in the kind of self-imposed suffering, regarding suicidal ideation, loss to suicide, familial suicide loss, dealing with eating disorders and disordered eating and thinking, all of that has something to do with our interactions and engagement with society, but also there are internal things that take place that other people, won't ever necessarily see.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Um, so my next question is about your grandmother. Um, in addition to Bloodline, I think a lot of the opening poems after that center on stories of your grandmother,
Mhm.
such as your childhood summers with her in Jeju and her experience of fleeing home during the Korean War. What role did your grandmother play in your upbringing, and why did you want to focus on her in the opening of your book?
So, my Korean grandmother, um, didn't raise me per se, but I spent a lot of time in my childhood with her. We spent every summer in Korea, from as early as I can remember, probably 3 years old, until I was 12. And then we moved to Korea when I was 12, for a couple of years. And I attended an international school there. So I did spend a lot of time, with my grandmother, and she, first of all, represents the history of my family and, the lineage, the part of the lineage of my family that I'm very proud of and that I draw a lot of strength from. So my focus on her is first of all, she feels like in some ways the beginning of the history that I have had experience with in my family. We don't have any record of family before her because of Japanese, colonization of Korea. Things were lost, things were burned. So to me, she feels like the beginning, although I absolutely know that she was not. I include her because she's kind of the beginning of my story. There's a place in my house where I have her photograph. The earliest photograph that we have of her is at the highest point, in my home. And I do that as, just a recognition of beginnings and what we carry and how we carry it, especially as women. The book is very focused on women and matrilineage and, how things are passed down, the choices that we make as women, as mothers, and as daughters. So she taught me a lot. My mother often tells me that I'm a lot like my grandmother. So I like to think that, that there's a part of her in me somehow, and I used that in writing, so many of the poems in the book,
Yeah.
channeled it.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that part about your grandmother's photo. Like, did you say at the top of your house or something?
Yeah, that's the picture, that is in the poem How We Fly.
Um,
It's the same photo. So the poem How We Fly is focused on that picture.
mm, wow. Yeah, and I must say, like, I, as a Taiwanese American who like is also very connected with my grandmother, I would like also spend summers in Taiwan
Mm.
with her. So reading your poems about your Korean grandmother like brought back a lot of those really cherished memories of mine.
Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, they're some of the best memories of my life.
Yeah, great. The next question is about absence. Throughout your collection, you deal with many forms of absence: your sister's suicide, your father's leaving, disordered eating, sobriety, and many more. What makes you drawn to the idea of absence, and how has absence shaped you in your writing?
I think absence has shaped me, my identity, my life, my choices for as long as I can remember. The very first memory that I have is the night that my sister was born. My mother was obviously not home. She was at the hospital giving birth to my sister. And it was the first night that my father put me to bed. And he didn't pray with me. So this is when I was 3 years old, my first memory. And as he was walking away, and the first night of my life that my mother did not put me to bed and pray with me before bed, I remember telling myself, you are a big girl, you can do this on your own. So the absence of my mother that night, the very cursory kind of putting to bed by my father, and then watching his shadow kind of disappear down the hallway, and being left with just me, and telling myself I could do it, really set the stage for my life. It set the stage for my relationships, my romantic relationships. It set the stage really for how addiction began in my life, and disordered eating as well. Because any time in my life when I haven't met my own expectations, or I haven't been able to do something on my own, I'll reach for something that will make it feel as though I can, or make it look as though I can. So I think, different. And then, of course, when my father left when I was 10, there was that huge absence. And age 10 is a really difficult year to have a parent just disappear from your life. I think, especially to have a father. Well, maybe it's probably just different, but um, to have a father disappear at that time, right before puberty hits, it was a brutal time in my life. We then moved to Korea right after my father left. So it was then the absence of my American life. It was the absence of one identity for another, but then living in Korea, I was not regarded as Korean because I looked different. I looked like a mixed race person. So um, there was a lot of like staring, a lot of staring on the street, a lot of questions, people like reaching out to touch my hair. Or when I would speak Korean, everyone looked completely confused because I spoke Korean with a Korean accent. So, just things like that really played out in my childhood, have continued to kind of haunt me in different ways in my adult life. And then, of course, in 2017, I lost my nephew to suicide. And then 2 months later, my younger sister also took her life, and that was his mother. So, following that, um, those sudden and traumatic absences. After that, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and had really terrible symptoms for the first maybe up to 2 years, really acute symptoms of PTSD. So all of those absences, I think, have shaped my perception of the world, my relationship with myself, with others, and also with my ethnic identities and national identities.
Yeah, thank you so much for being vulnerable with your answer. Uh,
Sure.
and as a follow-up, how do you think poetry helps you cope with grief and loss?
Hmm. That question comes up sometimes. And I don't think it does. I
Mm.
don't think that poetry has helped me grieve at all. I think grief has made it possible for me to write poems.
Mm.
Um, but writing the poems, people have asked me in other interviews, was it cathartic or, did it help you heal? And I don't think so. I don't, it felt necessary. The poems that I've written about those losses, about grief, felt necessary, as in, if I didn't write them, things would be worse. Or, um, that so the way that poems form in my mind is maybe I'll see an image, I'll think about something that someone said to me, um, I'll remember a song lyric, I'll think about a photograph, and everything kind of comes together. And there's this feeling of urgency, like when all of those things come together, if I don't put it down on paper, um, I feel it in my body. So the poems, my previous book and so many poems in this book, I wrote because it felt urgent. It felt necessary. But at the end of the writing, the grief is still there.
Yeah.
So that's been my experience. I know it's different for everyone. Um, but that's my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, let's move on to the next question.
Okay.
Um, I wanted to add, like, I guess some of my personal thinking and like projects in this question. Because
Sure.
I'm an English major and I'm going to write a senior thesis this upcoming year. So for my senior thesis, I'm also interested in the idea of ghosts and hauntings in literature. In books like Toni Morrison's Beloved, I'm curious about how writers use ghosts to represent traumas so deep that they cannot be forgotten and must be
Mm,
acknowledged or resolved. Could you talk a bit more about the idea of hungry ghosts and how it connects to larger themes in your collection?
sure. Um, if you think about, when I think about the word hunger, I think about longing, emptiness, um, desire. When I think about the word ghost, um, a lot more comes to mind. For me, the meanings of that can be um, a version of myself that no longer exists. It can be um, something unfulfilled, whether it's a relationship or a dream or a memory, or being able to go back into the past and wanting to change something. On the other side of the meaning of ghost, of course, is literally people. And I've thought a lot about what my ancestors, what other people that I've lost have maybe needed or desired, that they didn't have, and started relating both of those words, those concepts, to my own struggles. So, when it comes to eating disorders, either withholding food, um, or overindulging in food, or working your body so hard in exercise that it causes damage to your body. There are so many different ways, that people experience disordered eating. And for me, it was always about um, not meeting my own expectations, about wishing for a different version of myself or a different world in which I could exist, in which all of the complicated parts of me, it would be okay um, to exist on all of those different planes and dimensions. Um, so to think about just a life and a lineage in terms of hunger and haunting really made sense to me, I think, mostly because of just my own personal experiences and my family's history. Um, Beloved is a brilliant book. Um, there's also the concept of living ghosts. So ghosts who are in fact still walking among us in some way. Um, and I reference those directly and indirectly, I think, in these poems. Um, and I experienced that also in the acute stages of PTSD where I was having hallucinations, visual and audio hallucinations. Um, and where, almost immediately after my sister died, I had another broken familial relationship, um, that was very painful after that. So always thinking about, um, absence and also presence, what has replaced the absence? It's not just empty space. Is it grief? Is it rage? Is it melancholy? Is it, an imagining of a different past or an imagining of the future? It can be so many different things. So when I discovered that the hungry ghosts, all of the 36 hungry ghosts, it just kind of automatically happened. I started relating in some way to each one of them and just starting to take down notes. Is this a ghost? Is this a hungry ghost that, um, has any sort of connection to my grandmother, in Korea? Is this one that has any connection to my grandmother in America, to my mother? I just started to, think about the past, as well as the present and my own struggles and draw connections to those.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, my next question is about form. You often write in a prose-like form, but some poems experiment with different poetic forms. For example, in Inheritance, you use slashes between phrases to give a sense
Mhm.
of separation and disjointed rhythm. In Pantun for My Father, you use the traditional Malaysian poetic form. Pantuum? Am I saying that right?
Yes,
Pantuum for My Father.
Pentum.
Pantuum. Oh,
Mhm.
okay. Use a traditional Malaysian poetic form where the second and fourth lines of each stanza are the first and third lines of the next stanza. What
Mhm.
compelled you to experiment with these poetic forms in your collection?
Um, it's funny because, sometimes I don't know. It's just how, I start writing and then it just feels right. So that poem Inheritance that you're talking about, I think at that time I was reading a lot of poems that used that form. And that when I started writing, I actually wrote Inheritance as a commissioned or a solicited poem for poetry, for Prairie Schooner, for the magazine Prairie Schooner. And so I sat down specifically to write about that experience. And the slashes just made sense. Someone else previously asked me about that, and how I came up with where to do those line breaks or use those slashes, those backslashes. I don't know. I can't explain in that particular poem what the process was. Um, but in referencing the Pantoum for My Father, that is a poem that I tried to write for like 25 years.
Wow.
I knew what I wanted to write about. I knew some of the phrases and some of the lines, and I just couldn't ever get it right in my head, about how it was going to look. And then I discovered the Pantoum and began to learn about the Pantoum and read, really effective Pantoums. And I started to write the poem. I wrote that poem in like 20 minutes, because I think it was formulating for so many years in my head. And I wanted to write that Pantoum with very, like, you can write a Pantoum and vary the words that you use as long as some of the words are the same. But I wanted to use, um, in the repetition lines, I wanted to use a lot of repetition. And the reason I wanted to use a lot of repetition in that particular poem is because that is how I experienced the loss that I was writing about, and the process of grieving in estrangement is something that not a lot of people, I feel like, write about. So, a parent can still be alive, but if you were estranged from that parent, it's a specific type of haunting, a specific type of grief. And in this case, it just made sense because, I had been grieving his absence for so long, but there had been periods of time where he had been in my life as well. And then also just patterns, like repeating patterns in my own life, understanding or coming to understand as a 45-year-old woman when I wrote that poem that just because I've suffered as a result of my parents' choices, it doesn't mean that my own children won't experience some kind of suffering as a result of me. It doesn't mean that, and of course, I wouldn't do it intentionally. It doesn't mean that I wouldn't cause suffering to myself. So, in other words, there's a line in that poem that I am not unlike my father. And that was a really important line in the poem, because in discovering my own demons, it's helped me to better understand the struggles, the dark sides of my own family members. It's been interesting. It's just been an interesting process writing about that as I get older.
Yeah, thank you for that response.
Mm-hmm.
My last question is about your last poem, Armistice. You mentioned the title of your book in these lines, quote, "On my pre-war map of Korea, the peninsula resembles a hare, steadying herself on hind legs, daughter of three gone kingdoms," unquote. What led you to choose this phrase as the book's title?
I wish I could turn the camera and show you what is to the right of me, because on the wall to the right of me is the map that I wrote the poem about. So I was sitting at a chair, that's to the left of me, where I wrote all of my books. And I would just sit and stare at this map. And if you look at a map of, if you look at a map of Korea, remove the divisions, or you can even look at a map of Korea where the divisions exist between North and South. It literally looks like a rabbit on its hind legs. So, when I recognize, and I guess I never knew that before. I told my mother about it, and she was like, "Yeah, everybody knows that," but I never noticed it before. So when I noticed it, I started thinking about this song called Santoki, which is about a rabbit climbing the mountains, trying to get somewhere, and I looked up I remembered the lyrics, and like I would sing it to myself, but then I also looked at the lyrics on paper, and started to, I think a week before that, um, because I'm a sixth grade teacher, I had been teaching geography to some students. And what I wrote about in that poem actually happened in my classroom, where a child had said that they would choose an island, like in the middle of the ocean, rather than live on land, because they knew that they would be safe from war. And her family had experienced war. So all of those kind of like images and lyrics and experiences came together in that poem. Um, and I ended the book with Armistice because I feel like all we ever really have in this life is a temporary reprieve from conflict, and as much as I I long for a unified Korea, it's likely that it's not going to happen. And, the generation that remembers a unified Korea is quickly passing away. There are very few people left that really have any memory of that. And the younger generation, there is a segment of the younger generation that is pro unification, but I would say that the majority of, post war Koreans, the generation that is going to have the most impact on the country, is much more practical, and has much more of a focus on economic success and doesn't have that historical memory, of all of the people that were lost, and um, what might have been possible if history had been written differently. So I guess there are a lot of reasons why I ended with that poem. I think about my own history and the choices that I've made, and I think, like anybody, as you get older, you think about that. What would have happened if I had done this or not done that? Um, and just the recognition, in Buddhism, and also just as a woman in recovery, that we just make choices on a daily basis about how to live in the world that we find ourselves in. And sometimes we get a reprieve from our own darkness.
Yeah. And I guess referring back to the title of the book, what does the phrase daughter of three gone kingdoms mean to you?
Mhm. So in Korean history, there are three kingdoms that existed, some of them for longer periods than another. And so that line in that poem was actually, I wasn't going to call the book Daughter of Three Gone Kingdoms, but me and Becky, who is the director, we're going back and forth about titles. And she, put this long, amazing list together of possible titles. And a lot of them were taken from lines in the poems. And when I read that one and thought about it as a title, I just thought it was perfect. Um, because daughter is a huge part of my identity. It is a book about matrilineage. Um, I think a lot about what is gone and what is absent and what remains, right? So I am a survivor in a lot of ways. I am also a result of history and the choices that my ancestors made. And yet so much of that history is just gone. It's disregarded. It was colonized, it was burned, it was migrated away from, it was survived and not survived. So, ending the book with armistice made sense for the reasons I explained. And the title, Daughter of Three Gone Kingdoms, is really about still being here. When histories have been, I don't know if lost is the right word, but they've morphed. They no longer exist in the same form, and yet here we are, trying to navigate our lives and the world.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like even after so much of our history is gone, we are still here and we have to deal with the loss of that.
That's right.